Hello again everyone, and welcome back to a very long overdue Intel update from the S2 Underground. Today, as usual, we are recording this the day prior on Christmas Eve to go out on Christmas Day. So I know how tough it is to have to work or be on duty for Christmas, so here's a shout out to everyone having to hold the line this holiday. Your work does not go unnoticed, and we here especially are thankful for it. So let's get this show on the road with the weather. Weather over the next 12 hours will be quite wintry for most of the nation, so a lot of you right about now should be lucky enough to have a white Christmas this year with limited visibility and low cloud ceilings offering that security blanket that we have all come to know and enjoy. We're also in a green illumination cycle with lunar illumination at 74.9%. And like I mentioned, lots of wintry weather for a good portion of the nation, most notably the Great Lakes region as well as the western United States. Pushing into NOTAMs for this cycle, there were a couple that caught my eye. Really, they're both kind of in the same area. They're both in Los Angeles, right at the airport there. But I didn't know what these were, so I thought it was kind of interesting to highlight them. They're both listed as being for VIP movement. Usually when we see VIP movement, we can see that they're for like the president or the vice president. Usually that's really the only reasons we see VIP temporary flight restrictions, but these did not have the normal, they were not underneath the normal presidential code, so I'm not really quite sure who the VIP is moving around in Los Angeles. And as you can see, the VIP window there for the TFR is quite large. It's from the 22nd of December until the 3rd of January. So somebody's doing something in Los Angeles, and they wanted a TFR for it because somebody important's moving around there. So I don't know. I'm sure I'll probably find out about it, after I do this brief, but I just didn't have the time to look it up. So I thought that was interesting to mention. For the civil unrest forecast, really no major change. We're seeing pretty much the same thing in all American cities at this point. Lots of looting, smash and grabs, things like that. There are a few different Antifa demonstrations planned for Portland and I think Seattle, but that's literally nothing new. There's one of these every day pretty much in those areas. So we'll just move right on to logistics. Again, we're really not seeing too many changes from the last cycle. We're getting to the winter season, so really things, the logistical issues that we're still having are going to be persistent logistical issues, like winter tires are going to be a huge thing for a lot of places because demand normally goes up for those in the winter time, so we're going to have some issues with that, but it's going to be localized. You might be able to go to one tire place and find winter tires and then go right down the street and there's a shortage. So it's really hard to figure out where these logistical shortages are occurring. So we'll move on to the national level shortages, and there's really one I wanted to mention, which is medical appliances. Things like casts and crutches and things that mobility equipment, things that you might need to move around and stuff like that for a medical injury or something. We've seen this in a couple of places around the country since, I think September or October. But it seems like these shortages are increasing in severity, which kind of makes sense. Usually hospitalizations climb up during the winter time. A lot of the elderly population tends to get hospitalization rates increase during the winter time. It's just something that happens every year. And we're starting to see that, of course, as our logistical situation is strained almost to a breaking point in a lot of areas, you might find that some of these more seasonal demands on things like mobility scooters and crutches and things like that are going to be a big problem for the winter time. So we're just seeing that. We're seeing that in a few different places around the country. You can hop on Twitter and just search for stuff and find a lot of these different cases. But again, it's really hard to tell where a shortage is going to be located at. Moving into critical infrastructure concerns, really we've had quite a bit of things happen in the cyber realm over the past few weeks. Most notably, recently, what's become known as a Log4j cyber attack or vulnerability, however you want to describe it. This one's a little hard to explain for those non-tech persons, and I'm certainly not a tech person as well, but just know that this is a vulnerability that called a lot of people into work overnight to run some patches for a large percentage of IT networks around the country. Basically, every IT network was called into work to kind of see what the issue is with this. Yet another cyber attack, or I don't know if it's officially been classified as a cyber attack, but It's certainly a vulnerability that's become shut down a lot of systems. It's possibly related to the next one, which is the Amazon Web Services outage. I'm not really read up on whether or not the two are linked or not, but Amazon Web Services has gone down for a significant portion of the country, at least twice since the last brief that we pushed out here. So the last one actually hit our area as well, where we're geographically located here in the Mid-Atlantic, and yeah, it just brings down a lot of web traffic. So Amazon Web Services runs a lot of the portion of the internet. They run a lot of government systems as well, so it kind of makes sense that they would be a target. And then switching gears from the cyber realm into more of the jab realm, the grocery store chain Kroger has announced that they are removing a lot of healthcare benefits and actually starting to charge insurance fees for all of their unjabbed employees as a way to target yet again the unjabbed population. So I mentioned that here on the critical infrastructure concerns because this is definitely an infrastructure concern, because if you go to the Kroger grocery store, if that's where you normally shop, you might find that you're going to have some staffing issues at your local grocery store. That's if you even wanted to continue giving them money after this. Because they're one of the very first. I don't think there's any other grocery store chain that has been as militant about this as Kroger has, with the exception of the grocery stores that have straight up just fired people for being unjabbed. But yeah, I just wanted to mention, hey, some grocery stores, mostly Kroger right now, are starting to do this, and as expected, employees are walking out. So it's this grand game of chicken that we keep talking about, and the workers are certainly not putting up with this, at least when it comes to Kroger's mandates. And finally, number 4 there, we are seeing, you might see a lot in the news lately about airline problems yet again, most notably a lot of Christmas Eve flight cancellations due to rising cases of blank, right, as we see that dreaded O word come back being used by the media this time. So this is kind of the attitude that we're seeing the MSM, the mainstream media, take with this. This headline from Al Jazeera, which reads, "Thousands of flights canceled due to blank-driven staff shortage. Delta, Lufthansa, United cancel flights on Christmas Eve and beyond as blank cases force personnel to take sick leave." Yeah, that sounds to me like what someone in my business might call a lie. This sounds an awful lot like another strike that's going on, because as we all know by now, anyone who has seen anything to do, like the mainstream media is really having a hard time covering this up, because a lot of news stations are reporting that this new variant, right, is like a cold, right? So yeah, very, very unlikely. It's more likely that these companies are experiencing workers walking out like last time, because as we remember, this is exactly the same story they ran the first time that places like Delta and Lufthansa and United had these problems. So sounds to me like it's another one of those, but I guess we'll find out in the future. Alright, so moving on to significant governmental actions. Up first is, in a move that surprises literally no one, least of all those of you who watch these briefings, Facebook has admitted that their fact checks are not based on facts at all, but are rather, quote, protected opinion under the First Amendment. This was the result of a court case that is currently ongoing against Facebook, in which Facebook had to explain why they censor information that is actually factually correct in every way. So Facebook's begrudging answer is that, JK, our fact checks aren't really based in facts at all, but are free speech. So there. I, for one, personally look forward to the tidal wave of lawsuits against Facebook from the tens of millions of people that have had their medical research deleted from that platform. It's going to be a very interesting time as we move forward on that one. Moving on to number 2, Congress is caught falsifying evidence once again. This was kind of an interesting one. Congressman Adam Schiff, yes, that guy, is in fact at it again. He got caught trying to enter into evidence text messages from Mark Meadows that he altered to make it look like Meadows is guilty of inciting or plotting or conspiring or whatever. So this is the whole. This is part of the whole January 6th Commission investigation that, from an analytical standpoint, is really just targeting of political enemies. So it's kind of interesting that they went through the effort of Adam Schiff went through the effort of adding in like punctuation where it didn't exist, and shortening messages and things like that to delete context. Very interesting that they're having to go that far to target political entities, if you even care about this kind of stuff anymore. I know a lot of people don't really care what Congress does these days, and I kind of understand it, but when it comes to what certain things Congress does, you might want to pay attention to this next one, which is number 3, that the Capitol Police's authority has been increased. So Biden signed into law a bill that authorizes the U.S. Capitol Police to call up the Washington, D.C. National Guard directly without any other authorizing entity. As one might expect, a lot of Americans see this as just the increasing militarization of our law enforcement and the increasing use of our National Guard as a domestic police force to target innocent Americans. And I would agree, but I'm also looking at things like from a staff officer position, and I have a lot of questions. The questions that go unanswered for the most part, such as, does this make the Capitol Police Chief a military commander-in-chief? Since a commander-in-chief is the only way that a military force can be called into active service, and the only way that a civilian can command a military force is if they are elected by the people to be a commander-in-chief, how does this work out? Do we now have an unelected police chief acting as a commander-in-chief for a military force on U.S. soil? And if so, is this person now subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice? If the intent of this law is to quickly mobilize the D.C. National Guard for war without waiting for the traditional approval process, somebody still has got to be in command at every step. You cannot have a military force do anything without a commander, so who is it? Honestly, I don't really think that very many people care about this kind of like legal gray area stuff, but I mean, most people seem to think that this is just yet another attempt to weaponize the police and the military against the American people, which is what the Biden regime has done ever since, even before day one, right? But as far as people like in the seat, like in the bureaucracy, I don't think they've thought about the implications of this at all, or they don't care since they have the monopoly on violence anyway. I just think that from like a staff position, like a logistical way of like, how do we make this work? Who do the orders? Who gives the orders? Who do they come from? Like, what is the chain of command here? What, who's the authorizing personnel? Like, how does this work? I just think that this is very interesting and certainly a very dangerous precedent. Yeah, this is going to be interesting to see how this works out, and I am sure that this will totally not get abused in the future. And number 4 is another development in the FBI's Whitmer entrapment case, is what I'm going to call it. Because the FBI is back at it again. This one's just kind of depressing to talk about. So here's kind of the rundown for those of you who don't know what this incident is. Back in October of last year, the FBI alleged that they foiled an attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, by a group of people who wanted to basically overthrow the government of Michigan. And almost immediately, like after that, the story started falling apart. Of the group of people that currently are still arrested and accused of this, a significant number of people turned out to actually be FBI agents. And most of the rest of these people were FBI informants. So a lot of people began looking into this a little bit more and began kind of seeing this as a case of the FBI trying to invent a domestic terrorism event by getting a staggering amount of undercover agents together to convince a couple of goobers on the internet to try to commit some kind of crime. And that's kind of where it sat for the longest time, and then every few months we hear some more about like how the case goes. And as time goes on, that's exactly what this is starting to look like full-blown. This looks like a very poorly planned false flag attack that was planned from the very start by the FBI. So far, the lead FBI agents, like the key players in this case, have had a lot of problems. For one, Richard Trask, a key member of the plot and also sort of the public face of this case, was arrested in July for trying to beat his wife to death following a dispute after a swinger party. Trask was the lead agent that signed the affidavit for the initial arrests and was basically the number one witness until he was fired by the FBI following his own arrest. But it gets better. One of the other key witnesses for the prosecution, Agent Jason Chambers, had a secret private security firm which has been linked to insider information, meaning that he used his access at the FBI to run a private security firm, which was strongly indicated because he tweeted about the arrests in this Michigan case before they were even made. And now, just a few days ago, it was revealed that Henri Campola, however you say his name, one of the agents that provided hundreds of hours of surveillance during this plot, which made up the bulk of evidence for this kidnapping attempt, right? Well, he was revealed to have a history of committing perjury or lying under oath. Oh, and now evidence is coming to light that the undercover agents and informants were actually the ones who did the overwhelming majority of the planning and orchestration of this so-called kidnapping attempt. Now, all of that being said, just to even things out here, don't get me wrong, I think that it's pretty clear that the dudes facing trial, like the guys who weren't FBI agents or informants, are not exactly the sharpest tools in the shed, if you know what I mean. Clearly there are some learning barriers amongst these guys, but taking a step back and looking at this from an analytical perspective, it's kind of embarrassing that the FBI's investigative skills are so poor. Like, bro, you want to plan a false flag attack so that you can save the day from the problem that you created? Fine, right? But you can't even get enough agents to stop beating their wives and lying under oath to do it? I mean, it's pretty bad when even BuzzFeed is coming to these conclusions, which is why a lot of these websites are talking about how sketchy this stuff is. The FBI is the entity who started all of this from the ground up. They picked the field. They picked and set up the T-ball, and they still can't even hit the ball. It's honestly pretty sad that the only attack that the FBI can prevent is the attack that they plan themselves, which I know is a loaded statement. Obviously, the FBI does work in other areas like counterterrorism and stuff like that, but man, it sure feels like the FBI is batting zero these days. I mean, you've got so many failures stacking up for them in just a year's time, and then you throw in intentional deception and lying and stuff like this into it, and it just doesn't look good for them, honestly. I mean, I guess it makes sense because it seems like the priorities of their leadership are politically based and not really focused on stopping the bad guys. You know, they're just focused on stopping political opponents, I guess, which is, I guess, been a thing for years now. But I guess it's kind of interesting all the same. I mean, I feel kind of bad for taking, like, cheap shots at the FBI all the time, but man, it's just they make it so easy to be disliked, and as an investigative agency, like, I mean, we've got everything from the Nashville bombing last year. You know, it's been a full year since, a vehicle-borne IED detonated in Nashville, and we have nothing. We have nothing on that. What about those ISIS guys that were running around Northern Virginia? How's that working out for you? You know, it's like there's so many failures for the FBI just stacking up. It's kind of embarrassing. If I worked for the FBI, I would be embarrassed. But yeah, it's going to take a long time, if it's even possible at all, for the FBI to kind of dig themselves out of the PR disaster that they're in. Because, man, I would really like to see some data on what most Americans think of the FBI specifically. And they're not the only agency that's screwing stuff up, but, man, their public perception lately has got to be like single digits. So, anyway, we'll move on to the National Guard stuff. So here is your slide showing the operational terms and graphics for those of you who don't have these memorized just yet, and let's move right into the Northeast. Really the only update is New Hampshire has sent a handful of soldiers to local area hospitals. We'll know more about this once we figure out, how that's going to go. So we're going to move right on to the Southeast, where we don't really have too many updates. There's really no updates to this slide. Again, the 149th is deploying overseas, so I doubt that medical mission is still going, but I haven't seen any data either way, so I'll just leave it there. And then moving to the Midwest, this is kind of an interesting dual update for Ohio, actually. So for Ohio, 25 members of the Ohio Military Reserve, which is kind of like their state guard, will be serving as prison guards at the Cuyahoga County Correction Center, which I think is Cincinnati, for the next 30 days, allegedly. This presents some interesting questions because one of the mainstream news articles that mentions this deployment also mentions that visitation of inmates will be reduced, as will attorney visits. So, is Ohio going to have military service members operating under God knows what title code, supervising inmates who are restricted from having their attorney visit? Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure it's probably not nearly as overblown as that, but I don't know. Well, like we've been saying around here for quite literally 2 years now, having the military stand in for a civilian agency, particularly in the field of law enforcement, not only presents the problems of conditioning soldiers and civilians alike to view these deployments as normal, but also we're having to think about these kinds of things now. So we here are of the opinion that military deployments of any kind on U.S. soil should always be treated with the utmost of care and transparency to avoid creating animosity and division amongst the population between the military and the civilian populace. You don't want that. But just looking around, this is a sentiment that completely went out the window with the deployment and staging of over 65,000 troops in Washington, D.C. back in January. So just like always, this deployment is not particularly nefarious on its own. It's not worth freaking out about, but the stage is being set, as it has already been set in a lot of areas, for bad things to happen down the line, and we don't want that, right? Also for Ohio, several Ohio National Guard units have been activated. Well, not really the whole unit, but just, how deployments of National Guards work is you've got volunteers, and volunteers have been called up to run the whole hospital thing again, right? So just like most states who've activated their National Guards, they are activating an unknown number of troops at this time to support area hospitals. Probably not too many, but it looked like a pretty significant deployment, so I threw it on there. Moving on down to Texas. Texas has been busy. They have been deploying staggering numbers of Army National Guard, Texas State Guard guys, DPS guys, so much so that the governor, Greg Abbott, has stated that they have roughly 10,000 State Guard, Army National Guard, and DPS guys down there on the border supporting that border mission, Operation Lone Star. So that's nothing to shake a stick at. That's a lot of people, and that's a very significant deployment, and I guess we'll see how it goes. But again, you start putting that many troops in a location for a long period of time, and you start getting things happening like everything from complacency issues to cartels starting to understand our TTPs a little bit better, to even just troops doing kind of stupid stuff sometimes. So everybody who's ever been in charge of a group of younger soldiers knows what I'm talking about there. People tend to treat it like a vacation sometimes, and that's not a good thing. So with larger numbers of troops in one spot and supporting one mission and getting kind of comfortable and getting set in for what looks to be like a very long-term mission, it could possibly not be the best warfighting effort that Texas could do. But I guess we'll see how it turns out. We've already seen a few different incidents pop up between local soldiers and then local population, and incidents between the cartels and soldiers. So I'm sure that for the mid to low level leadership, this is a headache and a half, I'm sure. Just because it's not particularly a pleasant mission, and it's not something that anybody really wants to do, I'm sure. So we'll keep an eye on it, though, and we'll let you know of any major concerns moving forward. Then finally, really out west, no major change. Basically, states are doing what they're going to do. I would suspect that Oregon is probably still dealing with the fallout from their abuse of National Guard assets. So, with the quick congressional inquiries and things like that, those guys getting treated poorly with regards to pay and such, I'm not sure if Oregon's going to have the gumption to actually deploy any troops for this new wave of, propaganda, I should say. It's kind of sweeping through the nation. So, with lockdowns coming back and looming out there for everyone, I think that everyone knew that this holiday season was going to be kind of ripe for that kind of action. So, as usual, it's come back, and I don't know, though, if Oregon's going to be able to actually deploy anybody, because they kind of burnt out their force when they during the first surge. So, I guess we'll find out as time goes on, though. Moving on to the K through 12 public school mask mandates, like I mentioned, this new wave of propaganda, I guess, this new variant is causing a lot of school districts around the country to lock down again and bring back mask mandates. We're not really seeing so much on a state-by-state at the state level now. I think people are kind of tired of it and kind of burnt out, and especially with Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, if you guys remember from last brief, was red. Well, it turns out this Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned the mask mandate and unanimously stated that the governor does not have the power to mandate masks. So I'm sure a lot of other states are looking at that and going, what is our Supreme Court going to do when the case gets to there? I don't know. I think a lot of the states that have implemented a hard, no questions asked mask mandate will probably not have too much trouble. But I thought it was interesting that Pennsylvania was ardently against it. So very interesting stuff indeed. And also quite interesting are the jab mandates, specifically for California, or rather the resistance to them. We're actually seeing quite a lot of resistance from local school districts in California against Gavin Newsom's orders mandating the jab for school children. A lot of school districts have come out and said they're adamantly not going to enforce this. They're not quietly doing anything. They're saying, no, you do not have the authority. Your mandates are not laws, so we're not enforcing your mandates. That's very interesting to me for California, because let's face it, California's got a really bad reputation for totalitarianism and just crazy stuff in general, so I think it's very surprising to see this level of resistance in California specifically. So we'll keep an eye on that and see how that turns out. You never really know. We might see some good news for the people of California here pretty soon. Who knows? And then overall for our resistance tracker, really no major changes here. It hasn't been enough time for things to go through the court systems to figure out how the state level leadership and how the military leadership is viewing these mandates. We do have one update for Texas, and that is that the National Guard in Texas is following in the steps of Oklahoma with regards to not mandating the jab for their National Guard soldiers. So, in classic Greg Abbott fashion, he waits until after Oklahoma got their nastygram from Big DOD, and once Texas saw that Lloyd Austin and his cronies aren't really going to do that much about states who defy the jab mandate, for at least for state orders, he implemented the same thing for Texas. So it is good that Texas is coming on board. That's good news, right? Texas has a very large military force, and they have their state guard as well, right? And there's a lot of defense industry and military bases in Texas. So thinking strategically, even though the big DoD infrastructure that is located in Texas is not really affected by Texas's military decisions, right? The stuff that the governor's saying, hey, the National Guard here doesn't have to have the jab if they don't want it, as long as they stay on state orders. That's not going to affect an armored vehicle factory, right? But if I were a senior military leader sitting up at the Pentagon, I would be sweating if a good portion of my tanks, my armored vehicles, my aircraft, my rail, and my oil was actually physically manufactured or located in a geographic area that is opposing me. So strategic terrain is important, right? And if the federal government is going to force states to set the precedent of opposing the federal government on a military level, then the federal government now has to think about military strategy and terrain. Let me say that one more time. If the federal government is going to drive a wedge between certain states and the federal government and encouraging a de facto political, social, and economic balkanization, then federal agencies are going to have to at least start thinking about the potentials for a military balkanization as well. I know that throwing that balkanization word around is going to trigger a few people, so I'm not saying that Texas and Oklahoma are going to militarily secede from the Union tomorrow. I'm just saying that some states are now pushing back against the federal government along military lines, which is a precedent that the DoD set by pushing their tyranny among the troops, right? The DoD started it, and they might not like it when the states start playing for keeps, like Oklahoma and Texas are now doing. So now that Texas has done this, I would be very interested to see what other states, if any states, decide to do the same for their National Guard troops. That's going to be very important to keep an eye on. Also important to keep an eye on is Ukraine. So I did not have time to cover the international issues that I wanted to talk about this time. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and I just briefly wanted to talk about kind of the most pressing one, which is Ukraine, right? Which is directly tied to all the stuff going on in Europe as well, like energy and stuff. But this is on a lot of people's minds, so I kind of wanted to address it now, and we can go into a deep dive on it later. I do think this needs yet another dedicated video on it because there's just too much to unpack here at the end of this brief. But the short version of why Ukraine is back in the news again is that Russia seems like they're going to fully invade Ukraine this time. Remember, Russia has already invaded Ukraine. They took Crimea and the Donbass and Luhansk, and right now Russia occupies roughly 8% of the landmass of Ukraine. Like, just let that sink in for a minute. In the 21st century, Russia has invaded 8% of another European nation. That's crazy just to think about that. And even crazier is that nothing has been done about it by NATO or the UN except for half-hearted sanctions that do absolutely nothing. Every single ceasefire that has been agreed upon, Russia has violated first and has taken the opportunity to fight dirty at every chance they get. We're talking thermobaric weapons, the intentional targeting of civilians, including women and children, and the targeting of medical and other humanitarian personnel. It is well known that the Russian separatists and the Russian forces do not usually take prisoners and frequently murder wounded Ukrainian soldiers on a regular basis. And right now, the world is yet again seeing a staggering amount of Russian troops massing on Ukraine's borders. We're seeing estimates of anywhere from 120,000 troops to 175,000 troops. And as for the rest of the world, Belarus and Russia have shut off the natural gas pipelines to Europe from their respective nations, which has caused the single highest spike in natural gas prices in history and is causing significant power outages, making all of those threats of a dark winter come true for many Europeans, right? And right now, a flotilla of 30 liquid natural gas tanker ships are on their way from the United States to Europe to assist with the shortage of gas throughout the continent. So even though the Western media tried to yank and pull the Ukrainian war, whichever way they need to kind of support their own ideas, make no mistake, at the end of the day, this is no romantic war. This is about as close to a total war as you can get without using nuclear weapons. But fear not, Vladimir Putin just threatened to use those a couple of days ago. And as for the Ukrainians, who are quite literally facing insurmountable odds, fighting off a foreign invader to save their homeland, with their allies turning their backs on them, I highly doubt that Ukrainian forces will be up for a clean fight or following the Geneva Conventions either. So, in other words, this is already about as nasty as it can get, and it's only going to get nastier if this escalates much further into a full-blown invasion. In fact, Russian Defense Minister, our boy Sergei Shoigu, has issued statements that Russia knows that the United States has shipped chemical and biological weapons to Ukraine for use against Russian forces. Now, an allegation by that from the Russian Defense Minister should perk you up. Now, whether or not that is true or not is up for debate. It would be a classic tactic to say, oh, you were going to attack us with chemical weapons, so we launched an invasion to prevent that. It is right in line with Shoigu's personality to draw parallels between the impending Russian invasion and the U.S. invading Iraq to get weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, right? So as far as the chemical weapons claims by Russia over the past couple of days, I myself don't think the U.S. has shipped chemical weapons to Ukraine. I think that's pretty ridiculous. Now, for sure, the United States would do some pretty horrific stuff. Like, I have no qualms about thinking that the United States might do something like this someday. But the U.S. has, at every step, done everything they can to placate Russia with Ukraine. So it doesn't really make sense for the United States to suddenly start supporting Ukraine for some reason. On a strategic level, the United States has bended the knee to Russia's every demand at every step since the Ukraine war started in like 2014, right? This has remained a constant under Biden, under Trump, going all the way back to Obama, right? Sure, we have seen an escalation by the United States to supply Ukraine with Javelins, but honestly, I wouldn't even call that an escalation, because it's not like we're giving them freaking main battle tanks, which is what they're facing. They're literally facing hundreds of main battle tanks, and Ukraine has really no significant ATGMs of their own, which is why they lost Crimea and why they lost pretty much the whole Donbass region. Because they didn't have enough ATGMs, and tanks rolled in, and hey, you can't really do much against reactive armor and stuff like that. So, I don't think that's an escalation. And again, the United States suddenly deciding to supply Ukraine with Javelins is not exactly it's like Ukraine's reaction is, gee, thanks, mister, where were they 8 years ago? That's I think that's what Ukraine's attitude towards that should be. It's what my attitude would be, like, oh, gee, thanks, you're giving me a Javelin against 200 T-72s or T-90s or whatever. I mean, honestly, I personally think that the Biden regime is closer to asking Ukraine to surrender than they are to helping them stop an invasion, which is something that Poland clearly thinks as well, as evidenced by their recent defense postures. Ukraine's fate does not bode well for Poland's own defense when Russia inevitably does not stop at Ukraine. So for the grand questions that everyone has been asking, there is a lot of uncertainty going around from the bottom all the way up to the top. If Russia decides to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when will it happen? I personally am thinking probably mid to late January if they are going to do it. It's still cold enough for winter operations, and Russia has been observed to be using new winter hardware. And lots of new winter camouflage schemes and things like that, so that kind of makes sense. And it's before the spring thaw, which will be inconvenient for logistical movements. They need that area in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine to run their tanks across very fast. It would make a lot of sense. It's just tank country down there, and of course tanks are like all-terrain vehicles, but still, like, just getting bogged down in mud is not great for a very fast invasion, which is what Russia will most likely go for. And with Russia pulling out the old standby of cutting off the natural gas to Europe, this supports that timeline. They did exactly the same thing when they invaded Crimea the first time, and we're seeing troops and landing craft being staged for the battle plan that most people think the Russians will use, which is a southern push with a pincer movement, perhaps to the north to Kiev. Stuff like that. So we can get into more of that later, but so when it comes to the question of what the United States will do if Russia launches a full-scale invasion, I don't know, but I think there is more than an even chance that the U.S. will do nothing at all. The U.S. will certainly not send any significant numbers of troops. That's pretty much out of the question, except for minor training roles or for observation or maybe a couple of ODAs and some other dudes doing some sneaky stuff down there. But we're not talking like, a whole corps or, like 3 corps not going to Ukraine for this. Like, that's just out of the question. Now, we might send small elements of troops to observe things or advise, but they're definitely not going east of the Dnieper, that's for sure. That's pretty much a given. As far as conventional guys. Now, unconventional guys, they can do whatever they want, but for the conventional guys, you're not going to have any significant force to do anything. Overall, my assessment is that the United States Secretary of Defense and other senior military leadership is more concerned with pushing sociological agendas and padding their wallets than warfare, especially in Ukraine. And taking the senior military strategists and leadership out of the room for a second, the executive branch as a whole is completely clueless on the art of war. They're taking advice from very junior personnel or people who are only there because they somehow managed to not get fired enough times to actually occupy a senior position. But all of that aside, we also have to remember that, look, is Ukraine really worth fighting for as an American? I mean, honestly, I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to say. I think that history has kind of screwed Ukraine over, and I think that they made the classic mistake of trusting the United States to do the right thing. And as we all know, even as Americans, that's just not going to happen. So I think that the Ukraine situation is unfortunate, and I think we're about to see some really bad videos on the TV here in the next few weeks. I hope I'm wrong on that. I hope that this is all just a big play by Russia to both bully NATO into not accepting Ukraine and at the same time test out a bunch of their new tools. But man, it sure looks like it's for real this time, and I guess we'll have to see how it plays out. But I get it. Like, most Americans do not care about Ukraine being invaded. You know, why should America care at all if there's no direct threat to their homeland? Well, the answer to that requires a bit of digression, so please bear with me for a minute. I think that with how our entire nation has recently changed very quickly, the reality of the current times is that there has never been more justification for the average American to pay attention to what happens outside our borders. Because, man, if the past couple of years have not shown you enough, things end up on our doorstep really quickly. There are so many things that have just ended up affecting our daily lives here that originated in other countries, and I'm not just talking about medical stuff, I'm talking about other stuff as well. Like, the one that I just can't stop thinking about is Afghanistan. Like, remember how many Americans were left there? And what did the U.S. government do in response? They sent the trusty FBI in to investigate aid groups for helping the survivors. And right now they're even floating the idea of unfreezing the Taliban's money. Like, what? That's why the lessons from the disastrous Afghanistan fiasco are so important. Not only will the U.S. military leadership try to sneak out the back door, knowingly leaving Americans behind, they will only engage in evacuation efforts after getting caught trying to sneak out. Oh, and for good measure, the commanding general will leave Americans behind so that he can steal a Toyota pickup truck as a war trophy after getting 13 service members killed and murdering an entire family with a drone strike that had zero intel supporting it just to try to save face. I cannot think of a more sickeningly ironic end to that war. Greedy leadership more obsessed with themselves than saving lives, innocent civilians getting killed for no reason whatsoever, and heroes getting the short end of the stick, a garbage mission and still doing outstanding work, only to get killed for it. If you don't think that the same thing could happen in Ukraine, just look at our current political and military leadership. How many of them got fired for leaving thousands of Americans behind? Not a single one. No one stepped down, no one got fired. The only person that got fired and went to jail was the one officer who publicly demanded accountability for the crime of leaving Americans behind. Yesterday, he was given a general discharge under honorable conditions, which is the most severe discharge they could technically give him for his alleged crimes. The Ukraine and Afghanistan could not be any more different on almost every level. But the one constant between these two countries and these two situations remains the same: the United States political and military leadership. And that's why I keep beating this dead horse. That alone should be enough evidence for Americans to get out of Ukraine right now. But I know that everyone cannot do that. Very few people are in Ukraine for vacation. If someone's going to go to Ukraine, especially with a war going on, there are reasons that are not trivial for staying there. But if you are an American in Ukraine right now who is even remotely considering the possibility of leaving, you need to start thinking about an egress plan right now. And don't just say, oh, I'll just hang out west of the Dnieper and head to Poland if things get rough. You might not be able to catch that train to Poland because don't you think that the rail lines will be needed to move around the Ukrainian military? And the roads might be clogged with millions of other people that had the same plan you did. And that is assuming that Russia doesn't start airstrikes on civilian populations, which we already know they will do. All I'm saying is that if you're stuck in Ukraine, you really need to have a good plan. Because you don't want to be relying on OSINT pages or bloggers or random Instagram accounts to get you home when and if things turn sour. That's why if you don't care about Ukraine, that's fine, but you should probably at least pay attention to the tactics that are used in this war. Because if you think that the first Russian tanks across the border won't be combined with a massive wave of cyber attacks here in the U.S., you are fooling yourself. If it gets to the end of January and suddenly we start seeing massive cyber attacks on everything from infrastructure to consumer-level entities, my first thought, among other things, is going to be, well, Russia's about to invade. That's right, your Netflix account going offline is directly linked to the position of a Russian tank in Ukraine. I'm sorry for the long-winded digression on this topic, but this is one of the main reasons that we really even exist as an entity, and we're still doing stuff like this. And our team's work to help evacuate people from Afghanistan during that crisis was a disturbing endeavor. And also the reason for being motivated to dedicate such a large amount of time to talking about something that most people just don't care about. I know I personally don't want to see anything similar to that disaster happen again, but with the State Department raising the travel advisory to the highest level, we're already seeing the stage being set again for another disaster of epic proportions. It's not even an issue of learning lessons from Afghanistan at this point, it's simply staffing. Like, if the same people in charge completely messed up Afghanistan and they are still in charge of stuff like this, why would you expect anything different? Afghanistan was enough of a headache for everyone that I know that without a doubt it's a skills thing. If the military and political leadership had the right skills, if they had the know-how to do it right the first time, they would, just to prevent the heartburn of criticism. But since there won't be any change on that front for a long time, I guess we'll have to keep doing what we're doing. In years past, we really didn't have to be concerned about problems like this. Something happens in another country around the world, who cares, right? Which is probably more of a curse than a blessing, because now so few people are informed or able to insulate themselves from these kinds of issues. But these days, in our interconnected digital world, the slightest international incident impacts the daily lives of Americans pretty much immediately. It makes everything so much more complex. An American might not be able to escape Ukraine because the State Department messed up Afghanistan. You might not be able to use your debit card because Russia launched a cyber attack on critical infrastructure here in the U.S. as a distraction to keep the American people occupied. You might have a natural gas shortage somewhere in Alabama because that natural gas was sold to Europe because Russia shut off the pipeline because they need to financially and logistically destabilize Europe to discourage a response to their invasion of Ukraine. Like we've mentioned before, globalism has worked for the people who wanted it, and now we're finding out just how vulnerable we are to such policies and mentalities. But all is not lost. There is some good news. And here it is. You, the American people, just doing what you know is the right thing to do is good news. And that's why I wanted to kind of end on a cheery note for once and talk about some of the ways that we are making moves in the right direction. This has become my favorite slide because it is one of the very few ways that we can actually measure the effectiveness of resistance efforts. By tracking the companies and entities that want to force tyranny upon the people, but were forced to abandon their plans, we can see just how effective it is when good people do the right thing. Sure, a lot of very powerful people have gotten us to the point that we are very vulnerable as a population, but this slide shows just how that game of chicken is going. We've got the Los Angeles School District fighting back. We've got major manufacturers and defense contractors that are huge, such as Boeing, General Electric, and Ingalls Shipbuilding. Not to mention you've got airline companies now that are starting to backpedal on their mandates. We're also seeing a lot of healthcare industries. HCA Healthcare, which is a massive nationwide healthcare system, along with the Cleveland Clinic. Everybody's heard of the Cleveland Clinic. These places are having to rescind their jab mandates because their healthcare workers are walking off the job because it's not right. So all of this resistance is great to see. It's good to see people standing up for what is right, and that's a very good thing to know moving forward into the future. So that's all I have for today, everyone. Thanks for watching, and thank you all for your support over the past year. It has really, really helped us out a lot and really helped us expand and grow and at least try to do good things. We might not be able to help as much as we like, but man, we're certainly going to try, and we're definitely going to try next year. So we'll see you next year, and always remember to fight in the shade.